Volume 1. So we have now, the session is being recorded. Yeah, we will have just the lecture recorded, just to let everybody know, but we will not record then the Q&A and the discussion after the lecture. Before we start, perhaps one comment on the current situation in the United Kingdom higher education. We are on strike at the moment. Yeah, it's over pay pensions, but also casualization, gender pay gap, the ethnic pay gap, casualization in general across the sector, the increase in workload. So us going ahead tonight with this session doesn't mean that we cross the picket line. The Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice on purpose has left the University of Nottingham. We are now an independent organization committed to create that space for critical scholarship outside formal academia. And it is also a response to the increasingly tight neoliberal monitoring regimes within the university that we finally came to that conclusion that we should go outside. So us being active tonight here on CSSGJ, we would see as part of the general struggle against the neoliberal university. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andy for his second lecture. Andy, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen. And of course, I will start with victory to the UCU and all my comrades who are fighting, hopefully for also for a better world. So what we're going to do today is actually engage with chapter 1 of Marx's Capital. And chapter 1 is entitled A Commodity, but if you look at the content, and I'll sort of expand on the point, quite a lot of it's to do with the commodity and money. Okay, so that's what we'll be looking at. And these are the points that I will cover. I'm going to try to stick, it will be within an hour, but I want to sort of go over a little bit of what I think was slightly rushed in the first lecture. So I think it could well be beyond my sort of target of 45 to 50 minutes towards an hour. So you can see there the sort of bullet points of what I intend to cover. Apart from the introduction and the sort of the summary at the end, the 4 points I want to make follow very closely to the 4 sections of chapter 1. So this is the slide that I wanted to return to from lecture 1 and just go over it a bit more, because it does tell you quite a lot about where I'm coming from in terms of my reading of the book. So if you look at this sort of central structure, 3x3 structure, which I didn't invent, it comes from work by Chris Arthur, although the content of it is much more my content than what he gave it. But the point I wanted to make is twofold, really, in terms of this central structure. The most obvious point is the content of each of the books. This is volume 1, this is volume 2, this is volume 3. And it is what Marx says on the tin, right? Volume 1 is about production, volume 2 is about circulation, and volume 3 is production and circulation in their combination. But the sort of the depth of understanding we get from thinking about this in terms of Marx's sort of categories of thought is in volume 1, he's looking at the essence, the essential relation of the capitalist mode of production. And that is revealed by him as the production of surplus value by workers exploited by capital. And then in volume 2, he looks at something which is less familiar to us, but very important in terms of understanding the capitalist mode of production, which is how capital changes its form in circulation. It moves from money capital to productive capital to commodity capital. And then thirdly, in combination, and the combination is the terrain in which Marx brings out the difference between the production of surplus value and the way in which it actually is expressed in the capitalist system, which is as profit. Up to the point of volume 3, he'd basically taking them as an identity. But in volume 3, he explains how the rate of surplus value is as he establishes by that point, is an expression of the degree of exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class. But the rate of profit is the real indicator for capitalists of the health of their individual capital and of the system as a whole. And it's only at that point that Marx really brings out the determinacy of crisis within the capitalist system, which he based on the idea that the rate of profit is bound to decline within the capitalist social relations. As productivity of labor increases, in actual fact, the profitability of capital declines unless and until a new relationship between capital and labor is established, where basically workers are paid less for the labor that they contribute. So what we have here is a point which I want to emphasize is a sort of a pattern within each book. Marx tends to start from a particular example or taking an individual capital as a representative of the whole. And if you like, it's a sort of idea of a simple introduction to the concept. Then he will develop the concept and its different dimensions. And then he brings out at systemic level the dynamic contradiction which he sort of first outlined, developed, and now brings out much more. And this pattern repeats in the 3 volumes, especially in volumes 1 and 3. Okay, and finally, beyond this sort of central structure, which I'll try to explain briefly, there's a further additional points, one of which was made in a discussion after the first lecture, which is a very important point, and I completely acknowledge it. This way of presentation does slightly understate the significance of some of the other sections. So, for example, in volume 3, from part 4 of that volume onwards, Marx actually looks at how capital organizes itself in capital markets, commercial capital, capital assets, especially including rents and land. And these are actually really important in terms of the way capitalism actually functions. So if you like, the reality of the capitalist mode of production is explained in broad terms here. So there's quite a long journey to get to here. I mean, one of the really important points about capitalist mode of production today is extractivism and the way multinational oil mining corporations rob the wealth of the global south, systematically and comprehensively. Well, the theory to explain that from Marx comes in his theory of land rent as a form of surplus profit. And this we get to quite late on in the book. So what I'm trying to say is emphasizes there's a unity to this structure, and to get to the real punchlines requires a certain degree of a compromiso, I think the English word, commitment to get to the whole of the work. Okay. There is another point that I want to bring out, and will come out in the first reading group and the second reading group, which is the starting point for volume 1. So we looked at the historical genesis of the capitalist mode of production, and in particular, the class relation on which it's based is itself a product of previous struggles, and that's the relationship between capital and labor. And so what Marx arrives at is if you like, the basic social class relation between capital and labor. That's the product of this genesis. That's one way of arriving at it. What Marx does in the first part of Capital is he arrives at capital-labor relationship, but in a different way. He doesn't arrive at it really historically. He arrives at it through almost a deductive type of way of arguing. It's not the status of this part 1 is a subject of an enormous amount of debate, which I will allude to, the main lines of debate. But the point is that what he's getting to is capital-labor relation, which is expressed by the production of surplus value. So what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about the positioning of this first part against the rest of the book as a whole. I mean, there are some analogies which we can use for this. So, I mean, you may or may not know about internal combustion engines. They may become very soon a product of history. I hope so. But in the meantime, it's useful to know how they work. And they work with a starter motor because the engine itself is quite heavy and it's based on a rotation which drives the pistons. The pistons drive the rotation. So it's, if you like, a self-propelling system once it gets going. But how does it get going? Well, in engines, we have, it used to be mechanically done, but now there's a little electric motor called a starter motor. And what that does is it's just an injection of electric current, turns over, and that turns the flywheel, which in turn turns over the bigger engine. So you have a sort of, from rest, an injection of energy to get cyclical motion going to spark off the main engine. So that's one analogy. Another analogy you might want to think about is this first part of Capital is a little bit like a sketch before the full painting. So sort of, if you like, the outline is there. There's not color, but you get the basic shape and organization of the thing. And then it over that is overlaid further development. And that is definitely part of what happens when what we're going to be looking at with part one. And it doesn't have to be necessarily that way around. I think this way of producing a work of art is actually the color is put in first and then the sort of lines come in afterwards. So we have to be a little bit flexible, but not too mechanical about what is it that comes first and what comes next. But it's just sort of this idea. And what the idea is really about is what comes first has to be explained in itself, but it also is a starting point to explain the larger whole. Okay. And this sort of duality is very much pertains to what Marx is doing in the first part of Das Kapital. So Marx's starter motor, or his sketch, has been interpreted. There's an enormous interpretive literature about this. It's one of the big debating points. And the convention for a couple of generations was really to see the first part of Volume 1 as addressing a historical phase of sort of like artisanal production before fully capitalist production. That interpretation has some basis in some of the comments Marx makes, but in general terms, it's gone out of favor. And one of the points of evidence arguing why it's gone out of favor is Marx's very first sentence. And if you read it out, you'll see that he's saying, look, I'm starting from capitalist society here, but I'm going to look at the most elementary form within capitalist society, which is the commodity. So there are other interpretations. One is that what we see in the first part is a sort of like a particular layer of the whole. Another is that it's actually the labor theory of value, which Marx elaborates in part one, is itself a theoretical fiction. It's a useful hermeneutic device. Actually, I think that more recently, there's been a strong emphasis particularly from the value form school, I would say, that part one actually provides a framework for the whole. And if you like, is polar opposite of the one I just said, right? Rather than being a throwaway, it's completely the most important part. My own view is that apart from the theoretical fiction one, all the others have some validity to them. But the way I see it is and this is why I've emphasized the work as a whole, you only really get the significance of part one from the point of view of the work as a whole. In other words, it presupposes arguments that Marx is later going to make. And I'm going to just sort of explain that a little bit more, because I really think it's important in looking at part one, which readers do often find quite difficult. I don't want to make it difficult by sort of assumption, but it might well help if you understand the direction of travel and why it's significant and what we're going to get to, right? So in this first sentence, Marx explains that the commodity is the elementary form of capitalist wealth. Now, I actually think it's useful to turn that the other way around, which is that we're also looking at the elementary form of the commodity. And in this elementary form, or it's often called the simple form of commodity production and circulation, the assumption is that commodities are labor products. They're products of labor. And in actual fact, what Marx does up to this point is he abstracts out of the class division. So in this initial stage, the class nature of capitalism is only implicit. It's a presupposition which will be developed later on in his exposition. So this first part is definitely a form of preparation for volume 1. He begins to explain interaction between production and circulation. And in this elementary form, values are produced in production, but they're expressed in circulation. Okay, that's a sort of layout, basic architecture of Marx's argument. And what this also means is that you can't really conceive of a commodity, not only conceive, commodities don't really come into existence as a permanent and repeated social form unless and also there's also money. In other words, for exchange, just like it takes two to tango, it takes two to exchange. And the exchange is between the commodity and money once markets become established as a social institution. So from the idea of commodity, we get the idea of money. And then from the idea of money, this is the train of thought that Marx takes us through in the first part. We get the idea of a special type of money, which is not dormant or passive, but is itself in some sense an active being, right? And this activity of money is that it manages, apparently in some magical way, to expand itself, become more money, or self-expanding value, as Marx calls it. Now, this is the idea of capital in circulation. Okay. Where does the capital manage to expand itself from is the problem that Marx poses at the very end of this first part. The labor power is a commodity which is unique. Labor power is unique because it's the one commodity which creates new value. In other words, it's the source of capital's expansion. It's not really self-expansion, it's expansion through exploiting labor. But the reason that Marx has this first part is before getting to labor power as a commodity, he wants to explain what is a commodity. And then he comes on to explain the special nature of labor power as a commodity. And I think another very important point in preparing for the main sort of substance of the argument in volume 1 is that Marx is also, he doesn't use this term actually very much, it's certainly not in the English translation, but what he's actually writing about is what ideologues of capitalism often claim is its greatness, which is the market economy. The market is, you know, market efficiency, the market's work, the markets is a high point of economic civilization. Well, what Marx is actually doing is he's explaining that from the market comes exploitation. So he starts off, if you like, with a market type form, but he generates the reality of exploitation from this form. So all is not so idyllic as has been claimed. So all of this flows out of the first part of volume 1 for the main argument about surplus value in volume 1. But also, by the way, I'm not at all original in what I say, I think, so far. I do think that the next 2 points have been largely overlooked by the literature, and I do emphasize them. The first is there is some explanation of this in the unpublished results and immediate result of the capitalism mode of production, which is at the end of the Penguin edition, the missing chapter. It's a good link actually between volume 1 and volume 2, and I'm going to recommend that it's read in conjunction with volume 2. But what Marx raises there is the notion of a capital form. Up to now, value is expressed through certain social objects, which are its value forms. And that will be the commodity is a value form. Money is a value form. It's a social object which carries value. Okay. What Marx develops beyond that is, well, what about money, which is capital? And he makes a transition then to different social forms, which are actually capital forms. So money is no longer just money. Money is capital in the process of its self-expansion. Okay. Now that's a big point of contrast with how he starts volume 1. And so it's no longer just value forms, it's capital forms. But an even bigger point of contrast is the beginning of volume 3. Because as we'll see, volume 1 starts with a commodity in its tension between being a use value and a value. And what Marx does in volume 3 is he starts from a different tension. So he doesn't just repeat what he's done in the beginning of volume 1. He actually starts from a different tension, which he is much more prepared to say right from the outset is a contradiction. And the contradiction of commodities that start within volume 3 is what he's already established, which is they are the product of labor which is exploited by capital, but also in a different sense, they're the product of capital. They're the means by which capital expands. And these two things are actually in contradiction. And so this is a more developed understanding of what the capitalist commodity is, or what role commodities play in a capitalist system. Okay, so I think that this is my point about presupposition. Marx, when he published volume 1, knew pretty much where he was going to take the argument, from an elementary form of the commodity to a much more developed capitalist commodity. So that's a sort of the overall positioning. What I want to do now, and I showed you this diagram in lecture 1, I'm just going to remind us all. This is a sort of schematic of chapter 1 and the orange bit, and then chapters 2 and 3, which I'll develop in the 3rd lecture. The movement that Marx takes us through starts off with how a commodity initially appears. He then moves from there into what is in effect the labor theory of value. He explains how what is common to all commodities must be human labor. And he explains that, and we'll come back to that in more detail. But what I want to emphasize is that his argument doesn't stop there. He takes this notion of essence and goes back to how value appears in a real situation of commodity exchange. And this is in section 1.3, which I'm going to spend quite a lot of time introducing you to Marx's argument there, because it is generally held to be the most difficult part. But what Marx is doing there is he's looking at exchange value a second time and in a different way to which he first looked at it, right? He's looking at it now in terms of how can it be that commodities have a price that actually they don't directly exchange for each other, they exchange for money, and then the money is used to buy other commodities. So he's going to explain that, okay? And then the fourth section of this first chapter is commentary on, having explained all this, in a commodity producing society, the social labor which takes place does not appear as itself. It appears in the form of the commodities which different producers put on the market. And this leads to forms of inverted consciousness, we might say, or distorted consciousness about what the social reality is. And this is the fetish idea. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to go through each of these sections and explain what I think Marx's argument is, and I hope that this will help you when you study it yourself or in group. Now, the title of section 1 is interesting. He says the two factors of the commodity are use value and value. Okay, and then this bracket, substance of value, magnitude of value, both those terms refer to value. Okay, so he's going to look at value in terms of its substance and value in terms of its magnitude. Now, the use value of a commodity is fairly easy to grasp, I would say. I mean, literally, one can grasp things like jugs of water, tables, chairs, laptop computers, pens, books, etc., etc. The things that are bought on the market have this sort of physical material nature to them, and they're very diverse. I mean, I've been talking about objects around in my study, right? But you can think of all kinds of other things that are bought and sold on the market, are commodities. So chemicals, coffee, you know, lamps, loads of things, right? Very diverse. So what they have is they're sort of got their own particular properties that they're useful or desirable in some way or another. Marx goes from use value to what he didn't christen this term, it was widely used before him, exchange value. And exchange value is the value that a commodity has in exchange. Now, what's interesting here is Marx emphasizes in this first run at explaining exchange value, he emphasizes the quantitative relation. And so he gives this example, which again is, he's not particularly novel in doing this. I mean, a political economy had been doing this type of comparison quite a lot before him, which is that 1/4 of corn equals 100 weight. That's these are old-fashioned English measures, I'm afraid. X 100 weight of iron. Okay. Now the equals in this expression should read something like is equivalent to. So 1/4 of corn is equivalent to certain 100 weights of iron. It doesn't matter what order these two terms are in. It could be the X 100 weight of iron equals 1/4 of corn. It makes no difference whatsoever to the sense of what's being said here. What's being said is that they are equivalent, but it's nothing to do with their use value. I mean, corn is not the same as iron. Okay, they've got a certain weight and a certain volume, but they really got very different uses. Okay, you can't make bread with iron, or you'd have a very heavy meal. But you've basically got identical magnitudes of something in them, which is not quite apparent. It's not immediately apparent what it is. It's a third thing. And this is what value is, according to Marx. A value is this third thing. But what then is value? I mean, it's a sort of slightly elusive category. Okay, so what Marx says is value has got a substance and a magnitude. And the substance of value, this sort of common element in commodities, is that the substance is that they are products of human labor. Okay, and if we wanted to say what's the magnitude, it would be the amount of time it takes to produce them under socially normal conditions, the socially necessary labor time. Okay, now there's some comments about this. He's moved from the initial appearance to what you might consider an inner or slightly abstracted concept of value, right? Which we can't actually see it, but it's objectively real, it's there. Okay, so in order to get from use value to value, which the two terms in his title, Marx has brought in a third concept, which is this exchange value. Okay, so what exchange value is an abstraction. It's abstracted from all this whole diversity of different use values to the thing which makes them commensurable, which is they do exchange. Okay, so we don't know what the thing is, but we do know that they do exchange in some relatively stable type ratios. So that's what he's looking for here. What is it that makes corn and 100 weight of iron commensurable? And his answer to that question is what makes them commensurable is that they both have a value, and this is common to both, and therefore it's this third thing which allows them to become commensurable with each other. He explains a bit more what is socially necessary labor time. As I've already noted, he sees this as the magnitude of value, And this thing about socially necessary needs some discussion. It's a social average. I mean, and he discusses this. He says, well, you know, some people work harder than others. Some people are not so, you know, quick at getting things done, but also the intensity might be imposed on them. If you look at the picture, there is a sort of a sense of, is this a yet capitalist or is it the early capitalism? So these are two women workers producing yarn from cotton. Okay, so they may be more or less skilled. I mean, they might be, who knows between the two who's the more skilled, right? But Marx actually puts this one to one side. He says, in principle, a skilled worker's effort can be reduced to a sort of a non-skilled one by some kind of multiple. There's a complexity to it, but we're going to put it all to one side. And it's not quite the same thing. They can overlap. And certainly all three of them can overlap, but there is another concept, which is productivity, which is not necessarily the skill of the worker, but how the conditions in which they're working allow them to produce more. And one of the big conditions is, of course, if they're using machinery, and that's the purpose of the cartoon. Although I'm actually a bit using this cartoon, but this lady here is turning the wheel with her hand. She's got multiple spindles rather than one spindle. But she's still doing a lot of work here in terms of physical effort. I mean, of course, what happened was that the turning of the wheel was taken over by river water power and then steam power. And that certainly would increase quite dramatically the productivity with the sort of the motor power of the machine. So productivity can be increased. A second way, which Marx touches on, but doesn't go into yet, you have to get into volume 3 to develop the point. But he does sort of identify the point, which is that the quality of natural conditions, which vary over the world, but you can be doing stuff. You can be doing stuff in a particular part of the world, like growing corn on particularly fertile soil, which will increase the productivity of labor. Okay, so the socially necessary labor time is not fixed. It will change, especially increasing labor productivity will decrease the time to produce a given commodity. And he gives the example of the power loom, which is used by weavers, the next stage of production after the spinners. Okay, and when it is the case that labor is more productive, they will be producing a greater mass of use values. There'll be more yarn spun, there will be more cloth woven. But because there's less socially necessary labor time required per unit, then the value of each unit will be less. Okay. And of course, this is dynamic. And so what you'll find is that the labor time it took to produce a commodity may be greater than actually what it becomes the new social norm to replace it. Okay, so this is also a dynamic moving picture. So that's section 1.1. This is section 1.2. I'm just going to double check this. Yes, here we go. Right. What he does here is he shifts the focus. Marx is so good at this. He just moves the focus away from the actual commodity as an object and a social form to what about the labor that produces it. Okay. And so what we're talking about isn't just individual commodity producers. What we're talking about is a society of commodity producers. And in such a society, pretty clear that some will be weaving, some will be spinning, some will be making tables, some will be, making other stuff, basically. Okay. So you have a social division of labor. In a commodity producing society, the commodities have a duality, their use values, as I've already sort of pointed out. Okay. Now, he does point out here, by the way, a very important point. It's to do with sort of like the green-red debate, as it's known. Marx fully accepts that in terms of use value, it's not just labor, it's not just labor which provides use values. It's nature very often which provides a great mass of wealth, which labor then works on and develops as material wealth. So he's very clear about this in terms of use values, and this aspect of wealth, nature plays a very important role. But then he does distinguish use value from value, as we've seen already. And he does say that in terms of value, what we've got is commodities are expressions in an objective sense of homogeneous human labor. So tailoring and weaving are different activities, but they also both are forms of labor. Okay. So what he deduces, or what he analyzes from this, is that labor producing commodities, because commodities have a twofold character, then the labor power which is expended in producing them in a commodity producing context, not in all forms of society, but in a commodity producing context, the labor that produces commodities must itself have a dual character. Okay. On the one hand, it's concrete useful labor, the weaving aspect or the spinning aspect, right? On the other hand, there's something about all these labors which they have in common, which allows them to be equalized and abstracted from. Okay, now there's an ambiguity or big discussion about how Marx phrases this. It's certainly true that you will find sentences in Capital where he states that what this common element is, if you like, a sort of in a physiological sense. Actually, this is the part of the quote, what I put in blue. It, you know, muscles, brains, this kind of expenditure of human capacity. Okay. Now, this is the basis of the formation of something else, which only applies in commodity producing societies, which is a process of social equalization, which is slightly different to, if you like, the biological basis of that equalization. And in another place, he writes, so he gives a slightly different emphasis to this, right? Just 2 pages on, he's again talking about the twofold character of labor. But in terms of this abstract side of labor, he says their objective character as values is purely social. So that's a move away from the sort of the biological, physiological explanation to one which is purely social. And what we're saying here is, because there's a social division of labor, each laborer is contributing part of the whole. They are part of a social totality and contributing a part to the overall labor in a commodity producing society. So that's 1.2. We're through, we're nearly halfway through the 4 parts of chapter 1. I'm just going to take a slight aside because I do think this is useful. When we talk about abstraction, and it also applies to abstract labor, but in many ways it's a key part of Marx's methodology. Now, the sort of a standard view or conventional view of abstraction is, well, you've got reality, and when we think about it, we're abstracting. Okay, which is true. I mean, it's true that there's an abstraction process taking place, but Marx has a different idea of abstraction as a category, in the sense that he again and again comes back to this idea that abstractions are actually something that happen in reality. It's not just us thinking about reality which causes abstraction. It's reality itself. Capitalist reality generates abstract forms. Okay, and what he means by this is slightly different. It's the idea of abstracting one element, and this one element becomes the dominant. So this sort of weak abstraction and strong abstraction, if you like, right? There's one element is selected and becomes the dominant element in a social reality. And his argument is really, when you think about commodity production and exchange, he's saying that capitalism works through abstracted social relations. Okay. Now, the abstract and the concrete exist in tension, and this is also then can be conveyed in thought. But both of these, all these points have some bearing on the idea of what is meant by abstract labor. Okay, there must be some process which takes place in reality of abstracting from the weaver and the tailor and the spinner, some equalization that takes place, and further some conversion of this labor into the form in which it is actually exchanged. And what we're going to come to is how Marx explains this. And this is a sort of the more advanced and developed part of his argument. Where he's going to end up is that money is an abstract social form of value. It is the concrete universal that expresses in an abstract way the value in all the commodities in a commodity producing society. Okay. Now this one is really me just developing the point about Marx's methodology. Most of this I do take from Ullmann's book, which I think is helpful in this regard. I think beyond Ullmann, it's quite important to understand Marx's concentration on form. I've mentioned this before, but it is certainly true that to read Capital, one has to be aware more or less all the time, or at least ask yourself the question, what level of abstraction are we dealing with here? What's the perspective or the vantage point? What's the level of generality? What's the scale? And so you can think of this level of abstraction as, if you like, a plane of analysis. Marx uses the term, he uses a sort of a scientific analogy, which is the microscope. He brings certain things into the foreground and focuses on them. It doesn't mean that they are taken out of their social reality. It's just that other aspects of that social reality exist but are in the background, or they're there but as assumptions or presuppositions. And this Marx does use this methodology a lot, right? And he definitely uses it to move between this sort of notion of inner and outer, appearance, essence, manifestation of the essence, moves his lens up and down, refocuses it. So the idea, I mean, this is just an analogy. You may find it useful, you may not. I mean, the idea is how, in a linear exposition, how do you get this multi-layered thing? Well, you have to keep shifting the plane of analysis and find a way of connecting them all together. Okay, I particularly like this meme. Not all the cartoons I've found to try to illustrate these points are brilliant. I think this one is quite brilliant. It might not seem it, but what Marx is doing here is he's deconstructing the commodity form. And in deconstructing it, through the power of his thinking, actually, the motivation for this is that things do not have to be this way. It's just a particular social form. It's not a natural form, it's a social form, and it came into existence and it will go out of existence. And that social form is exchange value, now in its second determination. And I want to explain this in more detail, but just to remind you, we've looked at exchange value already from the point of view of moving towards what different commodities have in common. What they have in common is socially necessary labor, abstracted so that they can be made equal. That's the labor theory of value. What we're going to now look at is how value actually in reality appears. So the notion, which is often overlooked until recent commentary of this, is the value form or exchange value. I hope my clicking works. Here we go. So Marx is arguing beyond the naturalistic theory of value. Okay, in all societies, you need labor to produce stuff. Okay, so what is specific to a society which is organized around commodity production? It has to be more specific. And what is specific about it is how the products of labor are commodities which are exchanged, put on the market, and exchanged on the market. So what he's going to do is construct how commodities are exchangeable at all. How does it work at all, right? And what he does here is he establishes what he calls the exchange relation of commodities, which, you know, we would say today is the market. Okay. And his argument is that value necessarily appears as exchange value. It's a sort of spatial metaphor. It's the inner that has an outer form of expression. Okay, so commodities are a value form. Okay, and you only have this in certain types of society. The products of labor will assume a value form only in certain types of society. Okay, and what he further argues is that this value form or the commodity is also co-determinous with money. So what he's going to do, and we'll go through it, is he's going to not only explain exchange value, but he's simultaneously constructing genetic derivation of money. Now, 1.3a is, I'm going to actually take about 3 or 4 slides to explain what's happening in this part, okay, this subsection of chapter 1. And it's called the simple, isolated, or accidental form of value. I'm obviously looking for cartoons and visuals to express what I wanted to say. And it looked like Homer Simpson was coming to my rescue here. But there's a big but. And I'll explain the but. It's actually very crucial. In actual fact, I'm going to use this cartoon as a slight counterfactual to what I'm trying to explain. What the cartoon says is, okay, I got linen, or his poor kids are the linen here, right? But I don't need linen, I want a coat. Now, this is the motivation for going into exchange. You have one thing and you want something else. And Marx does discuss this actually in chapter 3 about why the commodity producer requires an exchange to get the use value that they want. Okay, so Homer has got linen, but he wants a coat. Okay, now in this form of expression, Marx is saying something else. He's saying something different, and it's very easy not to recognize this. He's not saying, as we saw earlier, the equal sign is between, what was it, a quarter of corn and X hundredweight of iron. He's saying something different here. He's saying that 20 yards of linen are worth one coat. Okay, and this is what we're going to need to sort of really get hold of. This is not symmetrical. Where the coat is in this equation matters, and where the linen is matters. Okay, I mean, they have you can't just swap them around without changing the meaning of what's being said here. And Marx calls the position of the linen, he calls this the relative form, and he calls the coat, which is expressing the value of the linen, the equivalent form. Okay, so these are different roles. The coat serves as the material in which the value of the linen is expressed. Okay, it says here, he says here that the coat is the passive one. I don't think that quite fits actually with what we're going to see. I mean, in a sense, the coat is not the passive one, it's actually a very active one. Okay, but what is very important is to reset your understanding from what we looked at in 1.1. What the issue is here is Marx is trying to construct how you actually get to exchange. What is it that allows commodities to be exchanged? And he builds up his answer. What he does is he constructs or reconstructs or deconstructs even the exchange relation. So it's very important to see this as building an exchange relation. And what he says, his argument is this basically: to be exchangeable at all, the linen has to have its value expressed in the bodily form of another. So how much is 20 yards of linen worth? It's worth a coat. Okay, that's what this is saying. In this exchange relation, which is not yet an actual exchange, it's setting up the possibility of an exchange, right? What the coat's role here is to act as a mirror. It's like proto money. He comes onto money, but already the idea, the germ of the idea is already here. right? He's saying how the coat expresses the worth of the linen. It's a qualitative point he's making here, right? And it's not the point that I've got linen and I want a coat. That's not really the point here at all. The point is, what's my linen worth? I want to put it on the market. What's it worth? It's worth a coat. Okay. So the coat expresses the value of the linen. It doesn't express its own use value. In this relationship, I don't, it's not important to me that I can wear a coat to keep warm and keep the wind out, right? What's important in this relationship, quite specifically, is that the coat expresses what the linen is worth. Okay, doesn't express its own use value. It takes on a different social function here. Now, what Marx is actually doing here is, up to this point, the role of money was just assumed. It was like a given. What Marx is actually doing is trying to explain what money is and how it comes about. We're still in this 1.3a, the simple, isolated, or accidental form of value. And he goes into more detail. You will follow this detail as you read it through. And first of all, he looks at the 20 yards of linen side of it, right? And what he says here is, okay, well, we know what the value is, right? We know that the value is part of the total social labor of society, right? But how is it actually take on a real form? What's its objectivity, right? The objectivity of value is that it's part of the commodity. It is the social objectivity of the commodity, which is also the expression or the reality of value in a commodity exchanging society. Okay, so we know that they are congealed forms of labor, and that's what his analysis had already done. But he's saying that doesn't tell us how the value is itself expressed. It cannot be in the natural form. It has to be in this exchange relationship that we established, the actual form that the value has. Okay, and this is more of the same, that he's explaining this in some detail. Okay, and the last quote from this little bit: as a use value, the linen is something palpably different from the coat. As value, it is identical with the coat and therefore looks like the coat. Thus, the linen acquires a value form different from its natural form. And this is really quite almost mystical. And Marx says the thing about exchange value is that it seems quite mystical. He's actually trying to explain the mystical character. Okay, if you look at it from the point of view of the equivalent, the coat is the equivalent. Okay, the coat is the thing that expresses value. Okay, now it doesn't actually tell us what the value of the coat is, right? So 20 yards of linen is worth one coat. 40 yards of linen would be worth two coats. But that in and of itself does not tell us how much labor goes into the coat. Okay, so the coat has like a symbolic role, which does not yet declare its own value, right? So the coat, and this is Marx's argument, which you need to sort of concentrate on to get, right? What he's saying here is the coat's use value is what appears as the form of value. Okay, it's a bit weird. It's a bit, you need to get your head around it. But that is the argument, right? So the use value of the coat, it's got like a second use value, okay, or a second perspective on use value. Not that it's wearable and keeps you warm and stuff, but it's like its value. The coat is value, right? It's like it is the embodiment of abstract human labor. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about Marx's analogies from this, these analogies take you so far, and I quite like the physical analogies and so on, right? But when he's trying to explain this, the strongest analogies are actually social. And he sort of portrays the coat as being like royalty. The coat is majesty. The coat is king. The coat is queen. We all look up to the coat because it's something special and unique about it, right? We don't quite know what it is, but we give it this sort of privileged standing. Okay, that's the idea. And it's similar with religion. I mean, I don't want to tax it too much, but you know, like this great papal figure or godlike figure which expresses something in everything else, but it itself is special and unique. Okay. He uses Aristotle as an example. He considers Aristotle to be a genius because Aristotle worked out that there has to be something in common between different objects to make them exchangeable. And he also worked out that this is the root to the genesis of money. So Aristotle was quite strong on, if you like, the form of exchange value. What he couldn't do is connect it to what is it that is this common thing, right? And he couldn't conceive that the common thing is actually equalized or equal human labor, right? He couldn't conceive of it because it didn't really exist in the society which he lived in, right? So Marx has got this comment on Aristotle, which is very sympathetic to him, right? But he's saying for the concept of value to even be conceivable, society has to have some basis of equality. And once there's a basis between different commodity producers of equality, then we can actually get the concept of the equality that will come on afterwards. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this, and it is, I think, worth drawing attention to, is that this is actually a slight tension in Marx himself. If you look at how he writes in the historical part about the genesis of capital, which includes all the really dirty stuff, the slavery, the colonialism, and so on, which are clearly unequal genesis through labor exploitation. He doesn't really bring all of this into the sort of dominant conceptual structure. And I think that there is an issue about the limits of equality which are being assumed here. So we're still back in 1.3, and he sums this up. Okay, he's basically saying the natural form of commodity A figures only as the aspect of use value. So we're still interested in the linen as linen, right? It's still there, but as something to be used. But by very strong contrast, the coat isn't there in the thread and the color and all the rest of it. It's there because it expresses value. Now, he started off with this idea that the commodity has got both a use value and a value. And what he's done through positing this exchange relation is it externalized through the relation this internal opposition. So for value to be expressed, it needs to be put into a relation. You cannot find the value of an individual commodity except by putting it in the context of a relationship with other commodities. Okay. And he then goes on to say that this is historically, this way of human labor being expressed as in the objective form of something else is a particular development in humans. You know, it's a particular type of society which does this. You don't have to do it this way, right? So in this apparently simple, not so simple it turns out, right? But this simple form expresses the value of commodity A in one commodity of another kind. And this is the critical thing, right? Everything else kind of like drops from this. Once you get this, everything else begins to drop. So what he does is he develops this. He says, well, I've got 20 yards of linen equal one coat, but why not 20 yards of linen equal 10 pounds of tea, so much coffee, so much gold, slips it in there, so much iron, etc. So he's extending, he's bringing in other possibilities, which are no longer sort of accidental, but there's some kind of maybe extended exchange relations being set up here. Now, each of these is a mirror, okay? But then what he does is he says, well, if we can do this, why not just flip it around? If we're saying that 20 yards of linen equals one coat, we could have set it up the other way around. I mean, they're not symmetrical, but we could make the argument the other way around. What's the value of a coat? Oh, it's worth 20 yards of linen. That's what it's worth. Okay. And then the linen would begin to take on the property of being this sort of equivalent form. Okay. And that's what he does. He says, well, let's do it. Let's then flip it that way around. And what you then begin to get is the clearer emergence of something which is a bit like money. Okay, so you got linen, which is the equivalent of all these other commodities. It's playing that role not just once, but in a unified, fairly like systemic way. So this commodity becomes the general expression of value. Okay, it's the general equivalent, I think he calls it, their general form of value. Okay, I don't want to lose you here, but I'll just come back again to this point about what is it? This is a process of social abstraction. Okay, this equivalence is possible because one thing, it represents something which is in all the other commodities, and that one thing is an embodiment of the abstraction. It is the universal equivalent of value, right? But again, there's a slight ambiguity in Marx's expression of this. It's not just human labor in general that's been abstracted. It's human labor in the context of a division of labor in a commodity producing society. Human labor, which is a fragment of the social totality. And so we get to the more familiarly obsessed with form of the universal equivalent, which is gold, or if you like now, the money form. Precious metals are particularly suitable for playing this role because they can be divided up, that they themselves contain a lot of value. And this is the sort of the culmination thus far of Marx's argument. And a commodity has an exchange value in money, then it has a price. The price expresses its exchange value in money terms. And it's important to note that you can have a price before the actual sale of the commodity. The price is what puts the commodity on the market for sale. It's not its actual sale. It's not money. It's an ideal representation before the actual fact. Okay. So Marx has built an argument which he brings us to the idea that money is the universal equivalent of all commodity values. So it's explaining the social power of money. And he says that this is a form of fetishism because it seems like this is part of the physical properties of gold. You know, they're somehow magical. Okay. So that's his main argument here. We're closer to the end. I just keep my eye on time. Okay, I've taken an hour. I will go over an hour, but I hope this is supported by the infrastructure. The fetishism of the commodity comes out from this. Okay, and I'm really hard to summarize Marx's argument here. It's very clear from a series of quotes the argument he's making, right? Which is that the social relation of commodity producers does not appear as a social relation. It appears in the form of relationships between the commodities, the products of their labor. And so the commodities take on properties which they've kind of like appropriated from their producers. And that's the source of fetishism. I'm just going to make 2 or 3 more points before I in conclusion. Now we're in the last phase of this talk, right? Marx uses the term form. There are translation issues here, but it's more than an issue of translation. It's a question of the concept of what do we mean by form. So I've talked about value form. Well, there are 2 ways in which Marx uses the concept of form. The first is he's talking about the way things are done, a certain configuration. Okay, so his argument is that all societies will have social labor, right? But value is the form that social labor takes in the commodity producing societies. It's a certain way of structuring social labor. It's a certain configuration of social labor. And he also uses form in a different sense, which I've sort of rehearsed quite a lot, which is this question of the form of appearance as compared to inner content. And he does this twice. He looks at the initial form of appearance, and then he revisits it when the appearance is a manifestation of some discovered essence, and it brings it back out into the open. So exchange value is the form of value. Okay. Now, the interesting thing, I've used this term value forms, right, which is was ignored for a long time, to be honest with you, in the literature, Marxist literature, and has come back under discussion, right? It's very important to understand this, I think. Value forms are forms in both senses. They are an outer appearance of value, but they're the way that social labor appears in a commodity society. They're a particular configuration of social labor. So this is what we've covered. I'm just now really summarizing. There's a lot of content here. It is challenging, but don't give up. Be patient with the content, work with it, and in time the weight will lift and you will get there. Okay. And so I'm just now literally going to summarize. These are the main points. They're not all the points because they're very densely argued and closely related, right? Okay, but commodities are where there is production for exchange. Commodities have, as well as use values, they have a purely social objectivity. Okay, value is the configuration that social labor takes in a commodity producing society. This is the question of the substance and the magnitude of value. Exchange value is the form of appearance of value. And money is the externalized form of value. They're co-determinate. Money is universally equivalent. So they're distinguishable, but not separable. You cannot have value without exchange value, and vice versa. And then the fetishism point. So this is the project going forward. So this week, it's a matter of reading the historical chapters that were introduced in the first lecture. And then this is my recommendation for, roughly 12 or so pages at a time, 15 pages there, to read chapter 1. Okay, there are things to think about how to read it, which we'll look at in the reading group. Okay. That's it. I have finished now. Thank you.
Brilliant, Andy. Many thanks for that tour de force